I vividly remember the day Duke disappeared. My family was spending the day at the lake next to our little bungalow at a quaint property in northern Ontario. All four of us were swimming and splashing around in the warm lake water, attempting to quell the blistering August heat. Our only neighbor for miles, an old retired police officer named Benny, was smoking on his patio. I waved to him and he waved back. We were in the dog days of summer, and I was glad to be in the water. Duke loved the water as much as I did and was still very energetic, being a large middle-aged mutt. We would often throw frisbees and sticks off the dock, where he would take flying leaps into the blue-green lake. That's exactly what we were doing when he vanished. As I was drawing back my hand to throw the frisbee for Duke, who was anticipating a throw and getting ready to run, he suddenly whipped his head to the woods. I too looked back at the rows of towering hardwoods and conifers, scanning them to see what Duke was looking at. It was nothing, at least, to me. What followed was a blur. Duke suddenly bolted for the trees, barking and snarling, all while we were screaming his name. I screamed at my parents to get out of the water and help me chase him. I even saw Benny spring out of his rocking chair to help us. I ran as fast as my 9-year-old legs could carry me into the dense forest, twigs and debris snapping under my feet. But you can only get so far in flip-flops before you trip. I tumbled to the ground, screaming and crying after accidentally scraping my leg against a sharp rock. My mom consoled me while I caught a glimpse of my dad running through the woods. It was a while before my dad and Benny came back. My dad had a somber look on his face. He didn't have to tell us what we already knew. But Benny looked shaken. I'm sorry, folks, but he ain't coming back," he said shakily. He took off his faded baseball cap respectfully and patted me on the shoulder before trudging up the hill back to his house. My whole family missed him, but to me it felt like a part of me left when Duke did. He had been my best friend since I was young, and I even had a small photo album packed with pictures of the two of us. For a while, every night before bed, I would sift through the laminated pages of the photo album, reminiscing about good times and praying that someday he would come back to us. Deep down, I knew he wouldn't. A few months after Duke disappeared, my dad arrived home from work with a surprise. It was another dog. It wasn't elegant and athletic like Duke was. It was one of those tiny, white, yappy ones with crusty red goop around its eyes. My parents fell in love with it. Princess, they called her, but I didn't. I simply referred to her as the dog. I was bitter, so bitter, because I'd interpreted my dad's gesture of kindness as his own confirmation of Duke's absence. In time, I did grow to tolerate her. I had to admit she was good company, and it was cute when she curled up by my feet. Life was going normally for us until Duke came back. It had almost been a year since Duke had disappeared. On this particular day, we were all cooped up inside, courtesy of the rain. I was engulfed in my book when suddenly I heard a bark. Not a high-pitched yap, but a deep, booming bark. I put down my book and rushed to the back door where I'd heard it, Princess scuttling at my heels. When I peeked through the window, I nearly fell over. It was Duke, somehow. By this time, my parents had arrived. My mom rushed past me and whirled the door open, while my dad and I hung back, mouths agape. As my mom hugged Duke, I couldn't help but notice something off. I'd spent countless hours spending time with him, and sleepless nights poring over photo albums. I'd familiarized myself with every spot, marking and quirk of Duke's fur. One of his most striking features was a black spot over his left eye, which had appeared in almost every one of the photos. But standing here was Duke. His eye spot was now on his right eye. As a matter of fact, his whole pelt seemed to have been flipped. He was missing his collar, and he was skinnier than we'd last seen him, but it was him all right. Well, that's what I'd thought. The first red flag was how Princess reacted to Duke. She was a yappy dog, all right, but when she saw Duke, she went ballistic, spitting and yapping like we'd never seen before. Princess barks at everything, remember? My dad told me, sensing my discomfort. She's probably just barking because he smells like the forest. And with that, he went outside to greet Duke. The barking must have alerted Benny, and he went outside to see what the commotion was. Once he saw what was going on, He darted back into his house and audibly slammed the door. When my parents came back inside, I tentatively stuck out a hand for Duke to sniff. He didn't wag his tail like I expected him to. All he did was quietly sit down. Then he heard Princess yapping from the other side of the room. His head swiveled and he lifted himself and padded confidently towards her. Before long, he had her cornered. All he was doing was standing and watching her, yet Princess's eyes were bulging as she howled and yapped. A sense of dread was beginning to creep up my spine. But before anything happened, my dad whistled, and Duke lifted his head. With one last glance at Princess, he slunk away. The sense of wrongness didn't alleviate for the rest of the time Duke was with us. The second red flag was that Duke didn't eat the food we put out for him. Granted, it was food intended for small dogs, but it was still the same formula. Dogs are wired to eat everything they can get their paws on anyways, so even then it wouldn't have mattered. Not once did I see him eat. Every time we let him outside in the woods to relieve himself, he came back 20 minutes later, his white muzzle stained pink. I found it odd that my parents didn't think he was at risk of running away again, but since he didn't run, I never brought it up. They spent all their time with Duke, petting him, coddling him, attempting to feed him, and playing with him. All this while completely ignoring Princess, as well as my objections. Something's different about him, I brought up during dinner one day. That's nonsense. What are you talking about? Said my dad. He's good old Duke. He looked at the dog as if searching for approval. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. As the summer went on, Duke seemed to gain more and more influence over my family. At this point, it was just me taking care of Princess. It was up to me to feed, walk, and take care of her now, as my parents had completely neglected her. This dog wasn't the Duke I used to know. Every time he walked into the same room that Princess was in, she would scuttle away in fear and into my arms. I took to always being in the same room as Princess just as a precaution. From what, I didn't want to admit, but deep down I think I knew. One day, Benny approached me while I was walking Princess. "You doing okay, kid?" Yeah, it's... I trailed off. Benny bent down to meet my height, his friendly blue eyes clouded with concern. "Be careful, kid. If you need any help, I'm right up here." Without another word, he turned and walked back into his house. When I came back from the walk, my mom announced that we were going to the store. Dad had figured out that Duke liked raw meat, and we had run out of it. As a matter of fact, we had run out of all other food in the house. But of course, in order to enter the grocery store, we needed to leave the dogs alone. I wanted to stay home and look after Princess, but my mom wasn't having it. "I don't know why you always insist on being around that dog," said my mom. "It's not healthy." "Look who's talking," I muttered. "We're going to buy a bunch of raw meat for a dumb dog." For that, she slapped me. Tears sprung from my eyes. "Don't you dare you speak about Duke that way." She huffed, "Get in the car." Without another word, I did as she said and got in, leaving Princess behind with the dog. I couldn't stop thinking about Princess as my parents cleared out the raw meat section. The drive home was nerve-wracking, and the walk up the driveway to our cottage was dreadful. I could hear the whimpering even before the door was open. Heart in my throat, I whirled the door open and screamed. Princess was under the kitchen table, leg bleeding profusely. No, it was gone. One of her legs was just gone. Curled up on the carpet was Duke, muzzle stained red. The rest of my family walked in. "Oh, the mess you've made, bad dog," my mom said as she scolded Princess. She gave a pathetic whimper in response. This was my breaking point. "Stop," I wailed. "Are you guys blind? He tried to kill her. She needs to go to the vet." Yeah, Duke, I have a snack for you." His ears shot up as my dad ripped open a package of ground beef. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten all day, and the only food we'd bought was meat for Duke. I was livid. This damn dog was taking them over. I didn't feel safe anymore. "I'm leaving," I announced. "I'm taking Princess with me." Tears were streaming down my face, even as no one acknowledged me. I packed a few belongings and grabbed a towel to wrap Princess in. I remembered what Benny had said to me earlier that day, and I knew what I had to do. As I trudged down the dirt trail to Benny's house, Thoughts collided into each other in my mind. Why were my parents ignoring me so much? Why didn't they care about Princess? Did they even love me anymore? The last one made me cry even harder. I reached the faded red door of Benny's house and knocked. He appeared a moment later, and when he saw me holding Princess with tears streaming down my face, his breath hitched. "I knew this would happen," he muttered gravely under his breath. "Get in my truck, kid. We'll go get your dog some help." He unlocked his truck, and without another word, I climbed silently into the back seat. I watched the cloud-dotted sky turn into pale shades of pink and purple as we sped down the bumpy road. After a while, we arrived at a small house which seemed to have been converted into a veterinarian clinic. Benny took Princess in his arms and rushed in, yelling for help. I followed along slowly and sat down in the waiting room, sad and defeated but too tired to cry even more. After a lot of frantic pleading, Princess was to receive emergency care. A woman in a teal veterinarian's uniform carried her away. I sprung out of my seat. "Let me go with her," I begged. Benny guided me away. "She's gonna get help now, kid. It's in God's hands now." I plopped back down and curled into a ball. Benny patted me on the back. A somber silence had appeared between us, when I broke it by asking Benny something that I hadn't gotten the chance to before. "Benny?" "Mm-hmm." "What did you mean when you said that you knew this would happen?" He tensed up. A guarded look crossed his face, then one of guilt. He exhaled a melancholy sigh. "Well, you see, kid, you know why I live alone?" he asked. I shook my head. "Well, I had family too once, Marjorie. And my son, James." A sad look crossed his face. "You remind me of him. We had a dog too, a beautiful pointer named Max. James loved him. So he was all torn up when he went running away. But one day, about a year later, we find him standing at the front door. Something's wrong in those woods. It changed Max. He wouldn't eat the dog food we got him, only raw meat. James was happy to see him, but Marge was happier. I found it strange because the night I'd brought Max home from the pound, she yelled at me like she never had before." Benny chuckled wistfully to himself. "Well, since I was busy patrolling all day and night, I didn't notice it as much as I should have. James kept missing school, and I noticed he was thinner. I told Marge that she had to take care of her son, but all she did all day was spend time with the dog. I tried to do the best I could, but I was a terrible dad and a terrible husband. I should have helped my wife. I should have protected James." He exhaled. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Benny shook his head. "I ain't finished yet. You see, one day me and my partner get a call. Some neighbors had called about a disturbance at my address. My partner was in the driver's seat, and I was the first one to get out of the car. When I walked in the house, I saw my boy in the middle of the kitchen, dead. The dog was eating him. Instinctively, I shot the dog. That's when Marge turned around with a knife. She lunged at me and I shot the fatal blow. All 3 members of my family dead in one night. My mouth was wide and the full weight of his words weighed heavy on me. Was that to be the future of my family? "Benny, that's terrible. I'm so sorry." I looked up at him to see a single tear trickling down on his otherwise stony expression. "I failed James as a father. I can't do the same with you, kiddo." After his story was finished, I felt my eyelids start to droop. I leaned on Benny's arm. "Good night, Benny." He was staring straight ahead, face emotionless. "Good night?" When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was how much my back hurt from sleeping on a chair all night. But I wasn't cold. Benny had put his tattered flannel jacket over me as a blanket. I sprung up from my chair and yelped at the receptionist. "Where's Benny?" She jumped in shock. "He went to go do some errands," he said. She got up from her chair and picked up a few items. "Take this, dearie. You must be starving." She placed a buttered bagel, a blueberry muffin, a banana, and a bottle of apple juice on the table next to me. She was right. I was starving. Food always tastes the best after you've been deprived of it. I ran my fingers over my ribs. I could feel each one protruding from my chest. This was the first time I'd been full in ages. The receptionist had informed me that Princess had made it and that she was in the recovery stage. When I saw her for the first time, my heart exploded out of love for Princess. and I hugged her gently. I smiled as she licked my face. I didn't know where else to go, so I played Scrabble with the receptionist for the rest of the day. I got to meet a fat cat named Mr. Cuddles, a rabbit named Twix, and I got to eat a hamburger for lunch. But all throughout the day I kept wondering, when would Benny be back? At 3:04 p.m. my question was answered as Benny stumbled through the door. There was blood on his clothes. A couple of police cars were waiting outside. "Let's get going, kid." Although I didn't get the full story immediately, I came to know the full extent of what had happened eventually. Even though he wasn't part of the police force anymore, Benny still had connections with the department and to the people that know what happened to his family. He gathered police officers and went to my house where they found Duke eating the carcasses of my parents. Benny shot him dead. I wept profusely for my parents, not for how they were to me in their final weeks, but for the people they once were. Benny assured me that they had loved me. There were not many people at the funeral, mostly townsfolk. Seeing as I didn't have any other relatives, the courts placed me in the custody of Benny after a lengthy court process. A few years later, he officially adopted me. Princess came to live with us too. Benny was proud of me when I went off to police college, when I got married, when my wife and I had a child. As per his wishes, we held him a small funeral. Life is generally good to me. I have a wonderful wife and an amazing daughter. Sometimes on the bad days in the dead of night, I thrash in my sleep as visions of dead dogs and screaming people writhe in my nightmares. But when I wake, I look at my daughter sleeping in her cradle, and my wife hugs me back to sleep. I remember that everything is okay now. It was discovered 25 miles off the coast of Maine by a lobster fisherman. The tip of a rusted run ladder, patinated and crusted with barnacles, jutting up through the ocean's glassy skin. You haven't heard about it on the news. You wouldn't have. The Navy buttoned it down faster than you can say Semper Fortis. Sonar scans showed the ladder descended in a vertical line for 8 miles. That's 6 miles past the ocean floor, disappearing into a newly discovered trench that made Mariana look like the shallow end of the pool. Okay, I'm being facetious, but it goes without saying that higher-ups were concerned. Who the hell had built a ladder in the middle of the ocean? Where'd this trench come from? Aliens, Russia. That's where I came in. I was a MEDOC officer in the Navy's oceanography program, working on experimental... Never mind. Not that it doesn't matter, it does. But if I talk about what I did, who I am, and why I'm here, I'd no doubt wake up on a trapdoor with a noose around my neck, and treason charges being read to me by a guy in a starched uniform. I figure there's a damn good chance that might happen anyway. Still, I'm compelled to document this because people deserve to know what I saw. The things that haunt the back of my eyelids when I close them at night. I'm in a military hospital right now, laid up in my own private suite. I'm trying to heal, but without rest it's proving impossible. I figure getting this out of my system might help. I hope it will, at least. But what do they say in Shawshank? Hope is a dangerous thing. Anyway, I was never great at beginnings, but I guess I should start with the dive. We called it a submersible, but it was really a suit. This was no Jules Verne clunky, cumbersome, sink-like-a-rock diving suit. It was lightweight, pressure-resistant, and equipped with all the bells and whistles that lent it its not unfair nickname, Iron Man. That's not to say it was one of those skin-tight jobs you see scuba divers wearing. It looked more like those suits guys defusing bombs in war zones wear. That aside, I was thankful there wasn't going to be a 60-pound oxygen tank misaligning my spine. The Iron Man was equipped with an electrolysis filter which converted ocean water into breathable oxygen. The whole shebang was invisible on enemy radars and could supposedly withstand a descent of this stature. Not that it had been tested. Basically, I'd be crawling down an ominous 8-mile ocean ladder in an experimental suit that had only been tried in Navy swimming pools. My colleagues seized on this predicament, jokingly calling me Laika in the hours leading up to the dive. In case you're not familiar, Laika was the dog Soviets shot up into space in the 50s, the dog who died. So as I stood on the helm of a small Navy vessel, also experimental, don't even ask, looking at the first few rungs of the ocean ladder which sat 20 feet off the starboard, I wondered if this was my last taste of fresh air. I hope your lunch wasn't too risky, my colleague Matilda joked with a smirk. Blowing gas in that thing, you'll probably suffocate. I smiled, but behind my smile were nerves, raw, tingling nerves. I think she saw because her hand landed on my shoulder. You'll do fine, Jones. This time I smiled for real, hoping she was right. The nearby tech asked me if I was ready. I nodded, and the bulky submersible's helmet descended me like a meteor. It really was Iron Man. The big window visor on the front of the helmet doubled as a screen, with oxygen and depth readings, as well as direct comms to from my people above the surface. There was a POV camera which fed them my perspective as well, so they could monitor and record my descent, which had started an hour ago. I climbed down rung after rung, daylight fading as I descended into the murky depths. Fish darted past. A little twist of seaweed rolled by. It was all very pastoral and oddly existential. The ocean, I'm talking the vast naked depths of it, is huge and never-ending. Look both ways and you see nothing but bluish-green water and swirling walls of sediment. A reminder of how incredibly small and inconsequential you are. It never much bothered me, until the climb. Now I'll never touch ocean water again. You good, Jones? Matilda's voice in my ear. Yeah, hon, I'm hunky freaking dory. My deltoids are screaming. Should've put in those hours at the gym. Where the hell are those taxpayer dollars going if you don't look good on a recruitment poster? I felt a smile creasing my face. The budget we got, they use models for that kind of thing. What? You're telling me that strapping young stud saying forged by the sea isn't a real seaman? What the hell did I join up for? I laughed. Sheesh, if I'd known I'd get this much one-on-one with you, I'd have put on Iron Man a long time ago. I'm here too. Bradley's voice. Imagine a drone operator, a gangly, pimply kid raised on Call of Duty. That's Bradley. What do they say about 3 being a crowd? I asked. They say you're closing in on 500 meters, Bradley said. Jesus, already? I looked around. It had gotten darker, the ocean around me fading into a deep dark blue that bled into a murky cloud. I double-checked my tether, secure. It was a thick steel cable feeding through a pulley, a thing on rollers about the size of a brick, which ran along the right outer bar of the ladder. The tether was there in case, for some reason, I lost my grip on the narrow, rusted rungs. 'Cause if that happened, well, anyone seen Gravity? I shuddered at the thought of sinking down and down with nothing and no one to save me. How's breathing? Matilda asked. I smiled at the concern in her voice. Looked up at the little black eye on the top right of the visor, a camera pointing down at me. They could see my face. I could, in theory, see them too, had they decided to beam some footage onto my visor screen. But this was no time for screwing around, and my visor was filled with numerical readings. On the left side sat a little map detailing the ladder and my position, a red dot on it. I had barely made a dent. Just fine, darling. The reason we weren't using a pod submersible, a single-man coffin connected to the above by a steel cable, was because I was on the lookout for any markings that might be etched into the ladder's metal skin, anything to denote its origin. So far there had been nothing but barnacles, a crab exoskeleton, and a thick patina of algae. When can I ladder slide? Or can you throw a movie up on my screen? This is getting tedious. I was half joking, but not really. It was boring as hell, one rung after the next. To make the descent faster, I was going to ladder slide, hands cupped around the outside rails, feet on the outside for brakes. But I couldn't do that until I hit certain water pressure, some geeky nonsense about how it would be easier to control the descent. The tether wouldn't be a problem there. The pulley was built to eat through rocks and had been satisfyingly crunching through barnacles the whole way down. Once you hit 1,000 meters, Bradley's voice, so you guys picked that number out of a hat? The deeper you go, the greater the pressure bearing down on you is, makes it easier to control. Shit. I must have skipped that day in school, I joked, partly. It was in the orientation, Bradley said, not trying to hide his irritation. I think he must have been jealous of my rapport with Matilda. I skipped that too. Matilda chuckled. I smiled again, even though I hadn't been joking. Closing in on 750 meters like a... Matilda said, calling me that goddamn dog. Better hope I've got a little more luck in my bones than risky canines, I said, secretly hoping I was right. I'd hate for you guys to fish me up and just find my naked skeleton. You've got charm. That's gotta be worth something, Matilda said, a smile in her voice. Is it worth dinner next week? Bradley groaned. God, you guys make me sick. I chuckled. Aw, don't get blue, kiddo. You can carry rings at the wedding. Matilda laughed. Dinner first, where? I know this great place called the Base Cafeteria. 8 o'clock Friday? It's a date, I said, continuing down into the abyss. I had worked up a killer sweat by the time I'd reached the midnight zone, which sat just past 1,000 meters. Murky blackness crushed in. It was suffocating, eerie. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted floodlights. 2 powerful beams of light blasted forward and... wham! An ugly deep-sea fish with a mouth of fangs went whizzing by my head. I barked a pathetic yelp and jerked back, nearly losing my grip on the ladder. What's wrong? You okay? Matilda asked, concerned. Fine, Satan's spawn just caught me off guard. Deep-sea life? The deepest. Your go for slide, Bradley said. I hesitated, suddenly not sure how I felt about plunging down at speeds unknown into the deep, inky blackness beneath me. Wish me luck, kids. Luck, Bradley and Matilda said in chorus. I sucked a deep breath, moved my hands and feet off the rungs into the outer rails, and then I slid. It wasn't as exciting as I thought, but it was considerably faster, and less draining, than climbing down. My eyes watched the ladder blur by, still on the lookout for any markings. Once or twice I skidded to a stop, thinking I had spotted something, only to discover it was nothing but deep-sea gunk caked to the metal. By the time I did see any markings, I was too far gone for anyone to care. I stopped, not sure what I was looking at. A strange symbol etched directly into the middle of the run in front of me. It looked like a weird cross between Arabic and Chinese. Guys, you seeing this? No reply. Hello? No reply. Finally, Matilda's voice. Jones, the footage is freaking out. You okay? I'm fine. Is this getting through? Silence. No reply. Jones, you there? Matilda, growing concerned. I said I'm cool. Bradley, distress in his voice. Buddy, you getting us? Just fine. Can you hear me? I felt panic squeezing at my lungs. Was the comm system freaking up? My screen began to flicker, glitching out. I was growing concerned. Jones, you're not coming through. I reached up to my visor and gave it a smack. The readings on the screen momentarily realigned before spazzing out beyond control. Now my colleagues' voices were warbled. Words were lost, full of static. Jones, can't hear, are you? Guys, I can't hear you. Fear in my voice, a low hum built in my ears, and then silence. No voices, nothing. My helmet basked in the glow of the flickering screen. I had lost contact with the world above. I froze, not sure what to do, split between the symbol on the rung and the disconnect from my safety net. Well, that's not completely true. Remember the tether connecting me to the rung ladder? There was a little button on the pulley box beneath a lucite case. Punch that button, and the pulley box would zip me back up to the surface. Okay, hell with it. I was going back up. None of this was worth a damn if I didn't have my crew watching my back. I fumbled out an underwater camera stashed in the pouch on my chest, snapped a photo of the symbol, and began the 10-foot climb back up to the pulley box. That's when I saw the mermaid. It flitted out of view, the silhouette of a man-sized fish. I froze, not sure what I'd seen. It had only been there for an instant, etched in the beam of my floodlights. Then it was gone. Had I really seen anything? My breath was shallow, cold in my helmet. I looked to my right. The water was black and murky. I looked to my left, and at first I didn't realize what I was seeing. A wall of bodies. Hundreds of mermaids surrounded me, their eyes glowing pinpricks in the light, their needle-sharp teeth jagged and yellow. They were awful deep-sea things, their tails yellow and scaly, their torsos pale and emaciated. Instead of arms, they had straw-thin appendages with hooked tips. When my light hit them, they broke apart, darting off into the darkness in a cacophony of shrill chitters. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my voice hoarse, my throat like sandpaper. I looked up and saw the pulley box 5 rungs away, the button taunting me, the button that would save me. Or maybe I was already past the point of saving. I didn't wait. I climbed, fast as I could go, 1 rung after the next, 4 rungs, 3, 2. A shrill chittering split through the water. I looked to my left as a mermaid shot toward me, its hooked appendages clawing at my suit. I grunted and threw up a defensive arm. A razor shredded through my flesh. Blood plumed out of my ruined arm. I cried out. My suit beeped, screaming warnings in my ear. The fabric instantly sucked together, automatically sealing the breach as the mermaid flew off, and in came another. I threw the button box on the pulley open, about to slam it down when a freight train barreled through my midsection. The horrible twisted face of the mermaid filled my visor. It had torn me off the ladder. I floated, entangled with this awful creature. Its gills undulated as it chittered in my face. A great ear-shredding sound that cut a bolt of fear through my stomach like an icy dagger. I grunted and jammed my fingers into its gills, hating the way its flesh crackled as I twisted. Now the mermaid was struggling out of my grip. I was winning, then I wasn't. Something pounded into the ladder, jarring the pulley box, and something else hammered into my back. It was like being caught in a trash compactor, a dozen of these things crushing in on me. I screamed, flailed, fought for my life. Then suddenly, the mermaids dispersed, tails flickering as they flew off into the depths. I was alone, completely alone, floating through the water, 15 feet from the ladder. I assessed the damage. My suit was mostly okay, except for my arm. Blood plumed through the fabric, funneled out and into the ocean. Each section of Iron Man was isolated, so if one part got damaged, it wouldn't compromise the integrity of the whole outfit. So water wasn't flooding my helmet. Yet, it very well could be. Soon, there was a crack in my visor. I quickly reeled myself in, closing in on the ladder and the pulley box, which was my last and final hope. Then I saw it. My heart sank. My stomach dropped. The pulley was nearly hanging off the ladder's rail. It was close to breaking off. If that happened, I'd simply drift, fall, die in this oppressive darkness. I moved slowly, surely, reeling myself in on the cable which rattled the box with each pull. I was lassoing the excess cable around my elbow as I went. My hands reached out, fingertips skimming the rung ladder. That's when I saw the shark. At first I thought it may have been a mountain that slid off land some long ago year, left to float these murky depths eternally. But no, it was a shark, the biggest living thing I'd ever seen in my whole life. It must have been twice the size of a Boeing 747. A great pale monster outlined in my floodlights, eyes as big as swimming pools. Its mouth. I couldn't bear to think what might be in its mouth. Oh my God, but that didn't seem to be enough. Oh my freaking God. It filled my horizon, moving closer. I was paralyzed by fear, my heart jackhammering my ribcage like a manic construction worker. My hands reached out for the ladder, grabbed a rung, started to pull myself up. When the pulley box broke free of the outer rail, I looked up and slipped. My hand slipped. My other hand shot out, grasped the ladder, and then a rush of water blew me away. The shark was passing, and I was sinking, propelled downward by the force of the shark's movement, displacing impossible tons of liquid as it swam. I flailed, grunted, screamed, the readings on my visor still flashing warnings. Then I was being sucked down into the depths. The shark continued on. I drifted down, the ladder slowly, painfully pulling away from me, until it faded from view. I tried calling to my people above, screaming into my helmet. At some point, I stopped, realizing they were long gone. And to them, so was I. I sunk for years. It felt that way at least, left to die, a prisoner of the ocean, stranded in a world of darkness. After a while, still sinking, I blacked out. I jolted awake at the bottom of the trench in the ruins of a great city. Pillars of rock, spires of stone, the husks of incredible mausoleums and colosseums rose around me, greenish in their eon-old patina. The city filled the trench as far as I could see, which was oddly far, seeing as a strange glowing orb filled my horizon. It was an impossible sun, a green ball of light pulsing and bubbling with heat, hovering off in the distance, bathing these alien depths in ethereal light. I stood up. A thin tendril of blood trailed up through the fabric from the gash on my forearm. I knew it wasn't a mortal cut, but it was nasty and left me feeling woozy. I cinched it tight with a Velcro strap and looked around. There was nothing but dead buildings stretching endlessly. Ugly deep-sea fish cut through vacant windows and doorways. I wandered the city for a while, looking for signs of life or any vestiges of the ladder that had brought me here. I found neither. I walked for a while. Hours. Days maybe. I slept some. I awoke and walked more. Time must have worked differently down there. The atmosphere felt languid and disorienting. I'm not sure how long I spent wandering. I found sprawling pictographs on the inside of a domed building. They depicted an aquatic people that once ruled this underwater world. I saw 100-foot effigies of a multi-headed dragon-like beast with a multitude of clawed legs and a variety of gills spread out across its form. Among them were other, smaller statues of the beast rolled into a ball. Sometime during my interminable sentence spent in that sunken kingdom, I realized the ball statues were depicting the beast's likeness as an infant, curled up in an egg. That gave new meaning to the glowing green orb on the horizon. Sometimes, after staring at the green sun for hours, I thought I could decipher the outline of the fetal beast wrapped in on itself, pulsing with life, waiting to be born. Eventually my mind slipped away from me. I heard voices, Matilda's, Bradley's, a barking dog I thought might have been Leica. Sometimes I spoke to them. Other times I didn't, just grateful for the company. And then, after a long, long while, I died. I was brought back to life on a lobster boat. 2 grizzled Mainers with accents like molasses found me floating listlessly and pulled me aboard. They scraped off my suit and resuscitated me on the fish gut-strewn deck of their little lobster tug. They thought I was dead. My skin was cold, pale as a fish belly. Then I blinked to life. I took a rattling breath of fresh air, savoring the salty taste on my tongue. I looked up at the real world, at the 2 men around me. All I could do was cry. I was brought to a hospital, then airlifted to the one I'm in now. Matilda came to visit me immediately. She asked me what had happened. I told her. I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me. I wouldn't believe me. I was gaunt, my hair long, my beard scraggly. I looked like I had survived a lifetime on a desert island, except for the fact that I was ghostly pale and not sunburned to a crackling brown. But it was good seeing her, until she looked me in the eyes, told me I had been missing for 8 months. Military man after military man came to visit me, higher-ups in crisp uniforms weighed down by medals. I was interviewed until my head spun. My story never changed. I told them to check my handheld camera. I learned it was never recovered. Whether they didn't believe me or didn't want to wasn't entirely clear. I had my scar to back up my story and my time spent missing. I told them to send another man down, but they gave me some bureaucratic word vomit about how the risk assessment blah blah blah. Apparently that suit I'd taken down wasn't cheap. Who would have thought? In the end, none of what I said seemed to matter. Perhaps they figured me for a deserter who took their top-secret tech and defected to God knows where. All I know is that at some point or another I was declared insane and ordered to a stint of convalescence. Where I remain, I've tried to make sense of it all, but I can't. I wonder about the ladder and whether it was built as an invitation to that underwater place or as an escape. Since I've gotten back, there's been a hollow ache in the center of my chest, a low hum in the pit of my soul. It's constant. It's dread. Dread at what I've seen. Dread at what might be growing in that green sun. dread at what might become of the world if that thing ever rises to reclaim its kingdom. I've come to the end of my tale, and I still don't feel any better. Every time I close my eyes, I see that green sun. I see it pulsing and flickering with life. And now I know for certain it's an egg. It was old, older than God, older than the 100-foot pines that towered above. It looked like a submarine hatch, sitting on a low concrete rise planted firmly in the forest floor. It wore a tight beard of pine needles over a rusted wheel handle with bolts the size of apples. It took both of us to get the handle to turn. Metal groaned in protest, screamed as it shaved away the layer of rust that had welded it shut. Together we pulled the lid open. It was heavy, heavier than a house. Then it split back on its hinge with a sigh of stale air. Darkness seemed to spill out of the hatchway, like it had been bottled up for eons and was now ready to infect the world. It looked as though a great metal mouth had opened up in the forest floor, a predator's mouth, starving and ready to feed. We peered down. A service ladder of rebar-like rungs descended the dark concrete bore into the great unknown. Hazy, overcast sunlight fought the darkness and lost, penetrating a meager 5 feet before shadow claimed the hole for its own. Sammy found a rock that looked like a cat's head, negotiated it over the hatch, and dropped it down. It whistled off into darkness. We waited, 2 teenage girls in the woods of Washington, listening for a sound that never came. That rock hitting the bottom. I was spending a month of summer with my cousin Sammy at our grandma's place up in northern Washington. It was a gray, unsunny July. I'd only been there a day. But a kingdom of storm clouds had rolled in off the ocean and pitched camp over our corner of Washington, issuing unto it low, endless drizzle that left the world soggy and awful. Today, however, the clouds had parted, puling back in a blast of sunlight and leaving Sammy and I to our daily dose of mischief, 2 purloined cigarettes. With the smokes in hand, we cut out through the trees behind Grandma's house in search of some place suitably grunge to light up. We followed a thin vein of hiking trail, eventually breaking off on our own through the wide, primordial riot of woods, not entirely claustrophobic, but dense enough that the massive pines would be warring for root space. We had been off the trail for no more than 10 minutes when Sammy called out to me, indicating the closed hatch that would eventually swallow us whole. We brushed away a thin skeleton of branches, a great bed of moss, a tangle of brush, to finally unearth the thing that resembled something city workers in bright orange vests might descend to access a gas main, which was odd because it bore no markings to denote its origin, not even warnings with penal codes to dissuade would-be vandals. It was anonymous and disconcerting, like its lack of designation meant it didn't belong, like it was an interloper. Sammy had asked me something. I looked up at her. What is it?" she repeated, curious gaze pinned on the hatch. "I don't know," I told her. "I don't know what it is." I knew it was old, older than God, older than the 100-foot pines that towered above. The hatch was open and Sammy wanted to go down. "Come on, Laney," she groaned. "It'll be fun. We'll poke around, take some shots for our feeds." "I'm not on that shit," I shot back. "Social media is the death of rational thought." "True," she grumbled, "but what are we supposed to do, hang out with Grandma all day and watch Rebel Without a Cause with commercials?" I took a long, pensive drag on the stale Winston, not wanting to admit that I was kind of terrified. Not only was I worried about the hatch lid slamming on us, trapping us in, but the thought of climbing down that shadowy ladder, of disappearing into the Earth's dark, quiet belly, made me want to vomit. Luckily, I didn't have to make any excuses. It started to rain. "Shit," Sammy hissed as the first spray of drizzle fell in gray sheets. "Help me close it. Don't want it to flood." The rain was a fine mist, nothing more than a sneeze, and I doubted very much if it would flood. But I was more than happy to help her seal off that dark orifice. We did, together, before heading back through the trees, leaving the hatch behind. We were soaked through by the time we made it back to Grandma's. She fixed us plates of hot lasagna, and we all watched James Dean's effortless cool in Rebel. My grandma's house was not unimpressive. It was a two-story Victorian rising in a collage of faded red and white from a wide lot of crabgrass. The open property hemmed by a wrought iron fence, all of it seemingly weighed down by 100 years of history. It looked like something out of a Tim Burton movie. A Gothic manor surrounded by woods. A lone raft stranded in a sea of trees. I was staying in my dad's old digs. A mess of ancient band posters and records. Breezy punk stuff like the Gun Club and the Wipers. Despite all the vinyl, I was plugged into Spotify, and Bowie was wailing Moonage Daydream when Sammy slipped in, face bright with mischief. "Come on," she said in an excited, breathy whisper. "Let's go." It was late, dark and late. I thought she had gone to bed, but she claimed a spot on the edge of my bed charged with nervous energy. I lost my headphones and shifted to look at her, her eyes wide and excited. "What?" I screwed my face into a confused knot. The thing, the hole in the ground, the mention of the hatch, the mouth, made my skin crawl. "What?" I said. "No way, it's like midnight. It's atmospheric," she countered. "It's pitch dark out. So we'll vlog it or something, record it, I don't know. It'll be fun." I groaned, shook my head. "No freaking way." "Then I'll go without you," Sammy huffed. "Into the hole? In the middle of the night?" "Yep, totally alone, so if I get molested by subdwelling mutates, it's on you. 'Cause you're the older cousin and all." "Don't be a bitch," I said, feeling my cheeks flare up. She smiled, a dimple forming beside her mouth, clearly amused at having manipulated me into a stalemate of mutually assured destruction. I was caught. Either I go with her and keep her in check, or I let her go alone and something might happen. She was 15, only a year younger than me, but impulsive and brash, and it wouldn't surprise me if she got hurt. I could claim ignorance, but if something happened, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Despite being just cousins, we had always been close, always been more like sisters than anything else. Sammy could drive me up the wall, but I still loved her, and I could see in her eyes that she wouldn't be swayed. I blew another long sigh, pushed myself off the bed, shrugged on my black windbreaker. "Let's get some flashlights," I said. I prayed for rain I knew wouldn't come. The clouds had burned off in the moonlight, leaving the heavens bright and clear. We had found a set of headlamps in Grandma's junk drawer and navigated the low woods by the watery beams they provided. I had also taken an old Swiss Army knife. It was made of rust and looked like it had survived the Great War. But I took it just in case. I was hoping I wouldn't need it, hoping we wouldn't find the hatch, hoping it would be lost in the riot of trees. But something deep down, a high tickle in the deepest wrinkles of my soul, told me we would find it. And we did, almost immediately. It resolved out of the darkness, a small brutalist platform rising out of the still damp soil. Had it been so close before? It must have been. Must have. Sammy was recording us with her phone, posting them on Instagram or something. Who knows? My vision had whittled down to a dizzying pinprick, and all I could hear was the hot rush of blood pounding through my ears. I helped her tug open the hatch, vaguely heard myself ask if she really wanted to do this. "Course I do," she said with a tight smile as she pocketed her phone. "It'll be exciting." Then she mounted the ladder and started off down the hatch. That sound only could have been made by the hatch lid slamming shut. We'd been climbing down the narrow bore for 5 minutes, each rung burning with a hot metal freeze that nibbled through flesh and seemed to lick at the bone, when there had been a loud metallic report. Thunk. We both froze on the ladder, Sammy just below me, panting like a tired dog. "What was that?" I whispered, hauling stale air through my aching lungs. "Why are..." Sammy started in her normal voice before dropping it an octave. "Why are you whispering?" "What was that?" I asked again, but I didn't have to ask. I already knew. She did too. I heard the growing scuffle of her climbing back up the ladder. I started too, one white-hot rung after the next, my palms burning, my heart beating, its angry fist against my ribs. The climb up was hard. My body seemed to weigh too much, like each limb was encased in lead as I pulled myself up. up, nearing what I knew I'd find, and I was right. The hatch was closed. I pounded on it, screamed, knowing that the only ones to hear would be us. I chipped away at it with the army knife to no avail. We tried our phones, first mine then Sammy's, pressing the devices to the lid's rough, rusted skin. No reception, nothing but the mouth, no one but us. 2 teenage girls, her with red hair, me with brown, trapped in an awful ladder with nowhere to go but down. "I don't like this," Sammy croaked. She sounded so young, like a little girl clutching her teddy bear after an especially dreadful nightmare. I didn't like it either. It was wrong. It was so wrong. The climb down the ladder had been impossible. Time fell away, shifting into a dull blur that didn't much matter. All that mattered was finding your footing as you lowered yourself down, rung after rung, step after step. It might have been an hour or 10, but a while later, a long while, we hit a wide concrete room. It was about the size of your average backyard. The ceiling low, unblemished, spare the circular opening through which the ladder ran. Shadows shifted and danced in black relief as we played our headlights across the dark space. On the wall opposite the ladder stood a wide, ruined opening. Nothing but darkness beyond it. The massive bank vault-style door that had once filled it sat in a twisted, broken heap nearby, torn free of its hinges by something that was disturbing. It sent a sudden flood of hot dread filling my guts like boiling water. But what was worse was the pyramid. It stood in the center of the room like a shitty roadside art sculpture, a painstaking pyramid fashioned out of countless rocks. I knew where those stones had come from. Sammy did too. They had been dropped from the above by people like us, hundreds of them, thousands, sacrificed to the darkness of the earth, the mouth. I knew because topping the pyramid like a Christmas tree star was the rock Sammy had dropped earlier. The exact same one, no doubt about it, tucked carefully atop the mountain of stones, placed there by someone, something. A high, trembling sound like an animal in a snare filled the room as the reality of the situation hit Sammy. She had started to cry. She was losing it, unraveling at the seams, sitting on the floor, knees to her chest, rocking and sobbing and apologizing for bringing me down here. We had to move. My whole body was one big screaming ache, and if we let exhaustion ease its warm blanket over our shoulders, we'd never get going. I sawed air through my lungs and boiled it into authority. "We have to go," I said. She sniffled. "What?" Her voice was nasally. She raised a trembling finger to the cracked entryway across the room. "Through there?" I nodded, struck one of the matches I still had from the cigarettes. The flame wavered, guttered as a breeze tugged at it. "There's a breeze," I said. "Airflow. Another way out." She sniffled, shook her head. "No way. I say we wait here, wait for someone to open the hatch." "No one knows we're down here," I reminded her. "No one." "But what if—" She started, looking at the pyramid of rocks. She lowered her voice, a hoarse whisper. "What if the thing that made that is in there? Where else would it be?" I thought. But I didn't say that. She was close to catatonia, and I needed her in motion. "We have nowhere else to go," I said. "Nowhere." She looked at me, her face pale and ghostly in the light of my headlamp. Her eyes were puffy red, bright with terror. Then she summoned her courage like one would a lungful of air, and nodded. I hauled her to her feet, and we started off through the doorway. The entryway had fed us into an underground hospital. It was abandoned, left to rot beneath the earth. A maze of scarred linoleum hallways, moldering gurneys with thick leather straps, blown-out doorways with padded rooms beyond. No, not a hospital, an asylum, or a laboratory, a kind of psycho-mixture of both. Its construction spoke of a time before technology and the advancement of human rights. Yellowed walls and popcorn ceilings were shredded, torn to ribbons. Like a feral, something had been set loose. Rusty smears of dry blood textured the white darkness here and there. It was awful. Each footfall, each pull of breath, all sound seemed to echo, clang, reverberate through the white walls of this underground labyrinth. It was like a nightmarish Escher painting. It was the mouth. Up until then, we had been negotiating slowly, rounding corners, finding more shadow-soaked hallways, passing an overturned reception desk, more padded cells, driven forth by terror and primal survival instinct. Then Sammy had whispered in my ear, her breath hot, her voice hoarse with terror, "There's someone following us." I froze. A cold infection of goosebumps went sprouting up over my body. My lungs were tight, empty of air. My heart was pounding with icy fear. I turned slowly, not wanting to make a sound, afraid that if I did, it might make the someone real. She must have imagined it. There was no one. There was. Then I saw the eyes, two dull, milky pinpricks hovering just outside the light of our headlamps. They were head level, higher than head level, unblinking, hovering and watching eyes. Sammy's body was right up against mine. She was wound up like an over-torqued screw. Terror radiated from her in hot waves. I could feel fear beating through her veins. Ka-thump, ka-thump, ka-thump. The eyes moved so suddenly that both of us screamed. They surged forward without any warning, rushed at us, the thing, the something, the awful subdwelling mutate that would devour our hot intestines while we were still shrieking. I saw its crooked, emaciated silhouette lumbering and lurching toward us. A tall, broken thing, its arms stick-like and so impossibly thin. Those glowing blind eyes set into a narrow, malformed head, as molded and precise as a canine skull. Then the creature hit our pool of light and the eyeballs popped out of thin air, like the light had vanished that thing, leaving only two marbles which clattered down, hit the floor, bounced, and rolled to our feet. They stared up at us, pale, seeing, and somehow blasphemous. Sammy and I jerked back and bolted like the wind. My cousin screamed and yanked me back just as solid ground dropped out beneath me. We had been in a blind rush, a blur of hallways scrolling by, passing padded cells with shadows that moved within them, when the floor had suddenly stopped being. Sammy grabbed my shirt and jerked me back just as I went tumbling out over the sudden chasm. After a gut-wrenching second of uncertainty, I found myself on solid ground, looking down at the vast, empty nothingness. There was a 20-foot canyon separating this side from the other, a thin, splintery plank board running across it. It looked like someone had shoveled out a massive crude pit in the hallway of the underground nightmare. We peered down, hauling air through broken lungs, hearts pounding, not sure what we were seeing. A solid knot of arms and legs, interwoven and laced together, filled out the bottom of the abyss. They were gray, broken, decayed. Torn flesh hung from bone, massive boils filled with hot, pus-textured, rotting skin. But this wasn't a shallow grave, and they weren't the departed. As soon as our light hit them, they slithered apart, breaking away like a hive of snakes under the burning heat of a magnifying glass. Dreadful heads, pained and drawn in agony, recoiled from the light, broken, human-like things forcing themselves off into shadow to reclaim what little salvation they had. They hissed and moaned and chuckled with insane humor, like condemned souls cast from heaven, forever banished to this pit of darkness for an existence of raw pain. "Oh my God," Sammy croaked. "Oh my God." But there was no God in this place. It was a great blasphemy born from the sin of the unrighteous. It was awesome and awful. It was... A low sound came from behind us, tucked into the cacophony of torment. Sammy didn't hear it, too taken with the pit of the damned. I slowly turned, my heart fluttering with icy dread, my stomach knotting in on itself. But the hallway behind us was empty. I blew a relieved sigh. The giant meat spider exploded out of the darkness with a throaty screech, a blur of limbs carrying it across the scuffed ceiling. But they weren't limbs. They were human arms and legs. I gasped as it rattled down the wall, hissing and pulsing with hideous life as it joined the floor and surged forward. It bubbled into the light, a nightmarish set of conjoined twins, two separate androgynous entities melded together, appendages beginning where others ended, scraps of face in all the wrong places, eyeballs and noses and mouths all scattered about its lumpy, fleshy form. It was a nightmare of terrible industry, and its head, much like a spider's, was bulbous and truly heinous. Patches of hair textured its lumpy scalp above rows of eyeballs and a wide mouth of thick razor teeth. Sammy turned, screamed, and stepped back. It was instinctive, a single misplaced move that sent her out over empty space. She reached out for me, her fingertips skimming my arm as she issued a surprised "ooh." Then she was gone, plummeting into the sea of souls, swallowed by the mass of forgotten bodies. I heard her shriek, heard her wail in bright agony as those things tore her limb for limb, picking her apart like a mean kid with a stunned fly. Then I looked up and a fleshy mass of teeth and eyes and hatred was atop me. The meat spider tore me down into darkness. I awoke in a biblical spiderweb to the reek of death. It was a dark, sticky place, hot with the stench of dead things. The smell flooded my lungs, burned my nose and eyes. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the gloomy haze. I'd lost my headlamp. Fibrous white nets resolved out of the darkness, stretching to and fro like an entropic masterpiece, all of it seemingly random and oddly beautiful in its precision. An incredible tapestry of psycho nature. Massive cocooned lumps textured the space, scattered throughout the nest like sleeping beauties. They were prey, and so was I. I couldn't move. I was melted to a wall of webbing by a spray of fiber, not entirely cocooned, but imprisoned in a straitjacket of dreadful string. I tried to scream, but my mouth was gagged with a shred of webbing. I issued a low, muffled shriek, the sound of despair. Then the entire formation began to tremble with a low vibration. I heard a tight hiss, saw a dark shape skitter by. The meat spider mounted the nearest cocoon and tore into it with its terrible human-like arms, craning its lumpy head to suck meat from bone. I heard congested slurping, things tearing, flesh and bone snapping apart. It was feeding, and it would come for me next. I slowly began to struggle, trying to work some slack into my binds, but they held firm. I felt something firm in my back pocket. I patted it desperately. The Swiss Army knife. I worked it out, popped the blade as the noise of feeding slowed, as the awful meat spider shredded its fill from one of its victims. I eased the rusty blade through the webbing and began to saw. It was like cutting through canvas. The web behind me instantly began to slacken, splitting apart, losing its tension as... Oh God, oh no! The meat spider lunged, drenched in still hot blood, moving with that deliberate speed afforded only to creepy crawlies. It was coming for me, arms and legs pumping, its misshapen form throbbing with terrible heat. I worked the Swiss Army knife harder, faster, hacking away blindly, hatcheting apart the web holding me captive. And I could smell it. Oh God, the reek of ancient rot, of things dead and decayed and hate, and it was here. Oh God, it was here. The meat spider lunged. For a terrifying instant, all I saw were eyes and teeth. There was a horrible intelligence in those eyes. An awful cunning that reminded me so much of the dead-eyed stare of serial killers in court. Then the web split beneath me and I fell. A second later, and I would have been girl meat. Instead, I was tumbling down, plummeting like a stone, the ground black and solid and rushing toward me. It slammed into me like a freight train and I crumpled like a bird. It wasn't solid ground, it was an angry rush of water. A river tumbled and heaved through a rocky canyon. The rapids frothed like a rabid dog, whipping me around like a rag doll in the hands of a brat. I snapped this way and that, barking my arms and legs and brain off lips of rock that seemed to bite out at me. Water that reeked of rotten gasoline and the thousands of dead things it had washed away flooded my mouth, filled my lungs. I choked and fought and tumbled downstream until blackness expanded. I awoke in a drain pipe to the first light of dawn. It painted strange shapes on the curved concrete bore in which I was delivered. I folded over and vomited a warm spray of water. A thin trickle ran from the darkness of the pipe, issuing through my hands, hair, flushing me with sobriety. That darkness repulsed me, made my skin ache and crawl with nausea. I staggered toward the light, fought my way out into a rocky shore. Seagulls were honking angrily, fighting over a scrap of meat on the beach. Other seabirds twisted through the foggy air above gray waters. The ocean heaved at my feet. I looked up at the sky and cried. A trucker found me limping along the highway like an abused dog. I didn't struggle when he dragged me to the car. I collapsed limply into his arms and let myself be taken. He rushed me to the nearest hospital. I found out I was 80 miles from Grandma's. I'm in a sterile white place now, a hospital that reminds me so much of that underground nightmare of things that should never see the light of day. I started this account hoping it would bring me peace, hoping it would help me come to terms with the trauma I'd faced. It hasn't helped at all. The police are still looking for the hatch and for Sammy's body. It's been 2 days and they've found neither. I was hoping normality would return, would burn away the nightmares that have haunted me since I've been back, but it hasn't. When I shut my eyes, I see things I'd seen out of the corner of my eyes in those padded rooms. Unspeakable horrors that belong not in this world but in a place far beyond it. God save them. It's an empty platitude, but it's all I can offer. God save them. I don't know what to think about this. Does anyone know what we should do? I guess I should start at the beginning. I'll do my best to say what happened. Recently, my brother Zach has gotten really into nature photography. Last weekend, we decided to go camping so he could take some pictures. We live on the East Coast, so finding places far from cities is pretty hard. Luckily, Zach found what seemed like this perfect place on Google Maps. The map showed a wide-open clearing right next to a road. It looked like a few hours' drive, but we decided to give it a shot. I packed up my gear and our dog Major. My brother loaded the car with his camera equipment and we set off towards the spot. As we got close, I saw that the paved road ended. An old no trespassing sign was hanging on a rusty gate. I could see a long dirt road curve out into the woods behind it. We didn't want to trespass, but we'd driven so far. I asked Zach what he thought. He figured that the road and the land was probably just the property of some lumber company. It sounded about right to me. We noticed that the gate blocking the road wasn't even locked, and that sealed the deal. Zach jumped out and opened it for the car. After that, we found the spot without too much trouble. It was pretty much perfect, at least at first. We unloaded our firewood and pretty soon had a good blaze going in the middle of the clearing. Major was running around sniffing everything, looking like he was having the time of his life. Major was a pit bull. We'd had him in our family for almost 5 years. He was a great dog, if a little dumb. I loved that dog more than most people. He had helped me through a lot of tough times. Soon it was dark. We had read online that there would be thick cloud cover that night. The prediction was spot on. It seemed like the clouds were thick logs, just brushing over the tops of the trees. The only light for miles came from our little fire. I started making some dinners wrapped in tinfoil. Zach was holding his camera, taking pictures of an owl that was sitting in a tree in the distance. He dropped his camera, letting it hang from its neck strap. He looked at me and complained about feeling uneasy. I figured he was just being anxious and didn't put much stock in it while I put together the food. Suddenly, silence rang out through the trees. I realize that may not make much sense, but let me explain. If any of you have ever gone camping in the forest, you know there is almost constant sound of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. It all stopped in a split second. I stood up from my chair and looked into the woods. A distinct clicking sound came echoing into the clearing. It came in bursts. 3 clicks, silence. 5 clicks, silence. It sounded wrong somehow, like nails on a chalkboard or a fork screeching across a china plate. I can't explain it, but the click mixed with the silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. Major jumped up and stared towards the sound. I could see how tense he was. He began barking like mad. Major always been an incredibly easygoing dog. He was freaking out like nothing I'd ever seen before. Before we could do anything, he bolted towards the sound. I jumped up and chased after him to the edge of the clearing, but he was too fast. He reached the tree line and disappeared into the darkness. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard. Zach was close behind me, his camera bouncing on its strap. The clicking stopped, and the chirping of crickets rang out again through the woods. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and shouted after Major. I heard nothing in response. Zach stood staring into the woods uneasily. He asked me what I thought the clicking noise was. I told him that I had no idea. I pulled out my flashlight and told him we needed to go after Major. He looked less than happy, but agreed. I turned back into the woods and started walking in the direction that Major had taken off. After just a few minutes of walking, the light of the small fire was completely blocked by the trees. The only light source that I could see was my flashlight. The woods seemed almost too dark. The thick clouds and remote location gave the woods an almost physical blackness. It reminded me of when I went caving a few years back. Zach and I kept on calling out to Major. After a few minutes, I heard a faint whimpering sound. I called for Zach to stop walking, and we listened. Zach nodded and whispered, "Yeah, that's Major, up ahead." We pushed on. Up in the distance, I saw a clearing in the trees. In the middle of it, I saw a huge concrete building. Decades-old graffiti covered the sides. It looked completely out of place in the middle of the woods. I pointed my flashlight at the ground around us. Neither me nor my brother could see any roads that led up to the building. Zach lifted his camera and took a picture. The flash lit up the clearing like a strike of lightning. While we stood there, I thought I heard the sounds of Major whimpering. They sounded like they were from inside the building. I started walking towards the building. Zach called out, "Hang on, man, let's think about this for a second." I got pretty mad. I wanted to go get my dog, who was scared and alone in this creepy building. I told Zach he was being ridiculous, especially if he was scared of some clicking. He whispered back to me, "All I'm saying is let's be careful, all right? No sense running in and cutting a leg open on a rusty piece of metal." I wish I'd had the sense to listen to him. We walked towards the building. A heavy metal door hung from its hinges in the front of the building. I walked through the doorway and started calling out to Major again. I heard Zach step through the door behind me as I made my way deeper into the structure. The floor and walls of the hallway were all made of rough concrete. I saw graffiti that must have been decades old covering the walls. The end of the hallway turned to the right. As I made the turn, I saw a pool of something discolored on the ground. The heavy stench of decay hit me like a wave. My flashlight flickered and went out. I stood in the darkness clicking the button, but nothing happened. I figured the batteries had to have run out. I unscrewed the battery cap, switched the position of the batteries, and then put it back on. The flashlight flicked on, but the light was faint. It spilled over what was clearly a several-day-old deer carcass lying on the ground. Its head was nowhere to be seen. Zach started retching and coughing into his sleeve. "Do you think a bear lives here or something?" he said between coughs. My flashlight died again. The darkness was absolute. The stench filling my nostrils made it hard to breathe. I called out again to Major. I heard Zach fiddling with his camera. "Here." He moved in front of me. The camera flashed, lighting up the hallway for a split second. "It'll help some, but not much," he said. "Maybe we should go back for more lights." I shook my head even though it was pointless in the dark. Who knows where Major will have run off to by the time we get back? I heard a yelp of fear and pain from up in the distance. "Just keep taking pictures." We kept walking down the hallway, careful to step around the deer. Every 3 seconds or so, Zach took a picture, lighting up the hallway and the rooms on either side that we passed. Some rooms had pools of fluid spilling into the hallways. Zach stopped suddenly and I ran into his back. "What is it?" He didn't respond, staring at his camera's display. "What is that?" he whispered under his breath. Then I heard it. A noise echoed down the hallway. Click, 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 getting louder. I felt numb. I stared into the blackness, not able to see anything. Zach took another picture and light flashed out. I saw it, whatever it was. It almost looked like a human, but deathly white, pale and naked. It had unnaturally long arms with claws that extended at least a foot from each finger. I saw something brown all over its chin and chest. I think it must have been dried blood. It was on all fours, staring at us. I shouted for Zach to run. I grabbed his shoulder, and we sprinted back down the hallway the way we'd come. I saw one more flash from Zach's camera just in time to step into the deer's body. We ran out of the building and into the woods. I don't know how we made it through the woods and back to the fire, but once we did, we didn't even pause to pack up our things. We jumped into the car and drove out of there. All this was yesterday. I can't stop thinking about Major. We left him there with whatever that thing was. Every time I think about it, my hands shake. Still, I can't stand the thought of Major out there alone. We're going to have to go back. We'll bring some weapons and more lights, and I hope that's enough. I'd call the police, but what will we say? We were trespassing. No, it has to be us. Me and Zach immediately started making plans to go back to the clearing to find our dog Major. A lot of you guys made some good suggestions that we decided to follow. We were both extremely shaken up. The thought of Major by himself out there, combined with the image of it crawling down the hallway, making that clicking sound. Our new plan was to go back to the clearing in the middle of the day. We decided to bring out our guns, extra lights, and batteries. I loaded up a shotgun that I could sling on my back, and Zach decided to take his 9mm pistol. Zach also brought his camera to document anything we saw. We reached the clearing around noon. We jumped out of our truck and walked towards the campsite. Our tent and campfire were in the same spot we'd left them when we'd run last night. We took a closer look and saw that the tent was all cut into ribbons. It wasn't torn. The walls were cut clean, like someone had taken a straight razor to the sides. Whatever had done it had rooted all around inside. Our sleeping bags were torn open, their white material scattered all around on the ground. To say I felt anxious at this point would be an understatement. After what I had seen last night, I already felt my hands shaking. I pulled out my shotgun and made sure a shell was in the chamber. Zach did the same with his pistol. We started walking in what we thought was the direction of the concrete building. We called out to Major and heard nothing in response. Zach stopped. He holstered his pistol and pulled out his camera. "Hang on, I'll take a picture." Zach pulled his gun back out and we continued. After about half an hour of wandering in what seemed like the right direction, we came upon a clearing. This was a different clearing from the other night, smaller with the trees leaning in. In the middle of this new clearing, we saw an old house. We walked around the back of the house where I saw a door that was hanging open. The dark interior of the building stood in stark contrast to the clearing. I looked at Zach. "Screw this place, man. We're here for that concrete building anyway. We need to get moving." We were about to leave when Zach called for me to stop. He crouched down and looked intently at the ground. "Take a look at this." He pointed with his pistol at a dog collar lying in the mud. I ran over and picked it up. It had Major stitched into it. It was torn and was covered in what looked like spots of dried blood. Zach pointed out paw prints in the mud that were clearly going in the direction of the open door. We approached the house with our guns drawn. We checked room by room. It looked like it was an old abandoned bar of some kind. Zach pulled out his camera. He shook his head. Why on earth would a bar be built in the middle of nowhere, and with no roads around? I told him I didn't know. Then I noticed a trail of what looked like day-old blood spots leading to a door that we hadn't seen before. The door was about half my height and set deep in the wall. I crouched down and opened it. The door opened to reveal a tunnel. I felt a blast of cool wind come out from the darkness. The air was tinged with something foul. The walls and floor of the tunnel were made of old brick or cobblestone of some kind. "This is too old," I said under my breath. Zach agreed with me. The bar we were in was 20 years old at most. These bricks looked like they'd been there at least a century. We were going to have to go down. Luckily, this time we were prepared. We had powerful helmet lights and had brought batteries to spare if we ran out. I can't explain to you how much dread I felt at the prospect of going down there. But I knew that I couldn't leave Major if there was even a chance that he was alive. We put on our lights, checked our guns, and started to make our way down the tunnel. I led the way with the shotgun in front of me. The tunnel was so low I had to duck my head and arch my back to not scrape against the ceiling. We made our way deeper underground. The tunnel curved, sometimes left, sometimes right, but always further down underground. Other branches appeared on either side of us occasionally. The headlamps did a good job of lighting up the tunnel at least. We kept moving forward. I felt moisture in the air coming from up ahead, and soon the ground was covered by an inch of water. Zach sniffed at the air in disgust. Maybe this tunnel system connects to the other building? I thought that was likely too. From up ahead I heard the sounds of whimpering. Zach and I ran splashing through the water into a larger room. I turned my head to the corner and my lamp lit up Major sitting in the corner, whimpering. I knelt down to take a look at him. He had 3 cuts that ran from his neck to the middle of his back. They were long, but not deep. They had already stopped bleeding. I pulled out a rope from my bag and slipped it over his head. I hugged him. "I guess you ran too fast, didn't you? Got away? Good boy." He licked me. I had just stood up when I heard the sound I'd been dreading since that night in the clearing. Click, click, click. I turned and pointed my headlight into a tunnel entrance in the wall. It lit up another hallway that extended some 30 feet. I saw it sitting there in the darkness. It was sitting with its back facing us. It was hunched over with its head turned to look over its shoulder at us. Its skin was almost white, and even from where I stood I saw its claws extending from its fingers. Its eyes reflected the light from my headlamp, like 2 pinpricks in the darkness. Then I heard it speak. It's beyond my power to describe how unnatural and wrong it sounded. It called my name, and then it said, I can't say what it said. I can't. I won't. My shotgun slipped from my hands and splashed in the water. I saw a flash from Zach's camera. I grabbed the rope around Major's neck and ran back out the hallway. I stopped halfway to vomit. I spat, then kept running, Zach close behind me. We ran through the house and back to our truck. We jumped in with Major and sped away. We made it back to our house and got Major the treatment he needed. A few days have passed since then. I wish I could say that was the end of it. I've started seeing it everywhere. It stands in the corner of rooms staring at me. When I look into mirrors, I see it behind me. It sits on the foot of my bed at night. I hear its whispers when the wind blows. It's calling me. It wants me to go back. I have to go back. I have to go back. This is Zach. I just read this entry on my brother's computer. He's been missing for 3 days now. I was there in that tunnel and I didn't hear it speak. Just the clicking. I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. The police are looking for him and I don't know what to say to them. Some creature made him run away. No, I think I'm going to have to go after him, and whatever this thing is. I don't know how I'm going to kill it, but I have to try. I'll post an update if anything else happens. I live in a rural town, far away from the bustling urban cities that many people live in. It's like those stereotypical small neighborhoods where everyone knows each other. I like living here in the fresh, unpolluted air with kind and friendly neighbors all around me. However, our town has a dark secret that no one speaks about. It's the woods right next to the town. Everyone in the town had gone to the woods at least once. We usually had some people go hunting there during the hunting season and also had plenty of people go for walks there. However, growing up, we have always heard terrible rumors about the forest. Amongst all the stories about mythical creatures in weird caves, one story in particular has stuck with me. The story goes like this. Around 30 years ago, back when most of our parents were also teenagers, one group of 4 teenagers decided to go camping in the summer holidays. Their parents supported it, and so they set off after a couple of days of preparation. On the first day, they quickly set up their tents, then went ahead and started to do a bit of exploration before settling down and setting up a campfire for the night. Towards the late evening, one of the teens, David the only survivor, felt like something was wrong. He had that deep gut feeling, the one that grips your heart with an icy grip. He didn't know how to vocalize this to his friends, but he did tell them he felt something was wrong. Imagine sitting with your friends in an open forest with tall, dark trees, a rather small campfire being the only source of light. You could say David was just scared, but he swore he could see a blur of movement in the thick darkness of the trees every now and then. He felt completely exposed out in the middle of nowhere, with the wind whistling against the trees. And then it happened. His friend Richard also noticed the movement in the trees. It was subtle before, but now it constantly appeared all around them. It was the blur of a dark humanoid figure that kept disappearing and then reappearing in some other spot again. It happened to always be out of the perimeter of the light of the campfire, so none of its details could ever be made out. By now the teenagers were spooked, and everyone had realized that there was definitely something out there. It was also hard to convince each other that the movement was nothing more than a wild animal, when the figure was quite obviously humanoid in shape. The group had two choices: to run back home quickly through the dark forest and be careful not to lose their way or trip and hurt themselves out in the middle of nowhere, or to stay put at the campsite and wait until the morning to return home. That same figure began to move more frantically through the shadowy silhouettes of the trees, seeming like it was circling them like a predator hunting its prey. David decided to make a run home through the woods as the others yelled out after him. He would later say it was a gut instinct that told him to run as far away as he could from that thing, to continue running until his legs burned and his lungs felt like they were being pulled apart. As soon as David ran halfway to the line of trees, the creature suddenly stopped moving, causing David to freeze. A menacing silence descended upon the forest. The group, with the exception of David, were still huddled around the campfire, shivering not from the cold, but from fear. The leaves began to rustle from beyond the tree line, and slowly but surely the figure that had been circling and watching them for some time now appeared out of the tree line. As its features began to be illuminated by the light from the campfire, the group's screams filled the silence. As David would later describe it, the creature had a humanoid body and was wearing long track pants and a hoodie. However, it had something very, very wrong about it. Its face was upside down. The large circular bloodshot eyes were in place of the mouth, while the nose was twisted and pointing upwards. The mouth of the creature was contorted into an upside-down grin which almost looked like a cartoonish frown. The teeth were razor-sharp and yellow with stains of red. Its skin was pale and thin, with blue veins visible all over the face. Its fingernails ended in long, sharp points like daggers. As the group stared at the creature in frozen fear, it lunged in a fraction of a second towards the three teenagers still next to the campfire. It used its nails to rip everyone apart in a few agonizing moments, like a paper shredder to a piece of paper. It then hungrily fed on the flesh of the dying teenagers. David broke out of his trance as soon as the creature locked its misplaced eyes directly with him. He turned around and began to run into the woods. The creature moved at an incredibly fast pace as it caught up to him in a matter of seconds. It grabbed David's arm and dug its nails deep into his shoulder until David's shrill screams could be heard from the town. It all happened in slow motion. David continued to pull away from the creature in a desperate attempt to run and get away from it. But the creature had a very solid grip of his entire arm. The creature had made one mistake, though, which let David survive. It had dug its nails so far into David's arm that after a few long moments of David desperately pulling away, his entire arm ripped away from his body. David would later continue running until he collapsed from blood loss. An early morning runner would find him by the side of the running trail, and he would make a miraculous recovery in a city hospital. The campsite would be found later by rescue crew, covered in blood and gore, with the barely recognizable bodies of the three boys arranged in a triangle around the long-dead campfire. David is still alive today, and he's told this story to every kid in town. You can see him stare out into the woods with his only hand leaning on the wooden fence of his balcony, watching the tree line with blank, empty eyes. People in our town would only go to the woods during the morning and be sure to come back before sunset. It's not that anyone fully believed David's story. Some thought he had developed false memories from the traumatic event, while some say he could have dreamed it up in his medically induced coma. But no one can deny the fact that that night, something did happen in the woods. People may have tried to comfort themselves by not believing his story, but no one dared camping in the woods again. This brings me back to my story. Yesterday I missed my typical morning run because of a work obligation, and so I decided to still exercise in the evening. The sun had mostly dipped under the horizon, and the sky had started to darken from the orange and purple color to a rather dark blue. The trees stood tall on either side of the trail, where only darkness existed beyond the tree line. I was running pretty fast and nearly back out of the woods and at home, when the sound of the birds completely stopped. A deafening silence permeated the air like the calm before a storm. I began to run even more frantically as bad thoughts began to appear in my mind. Just as I was at the end of the trail and out of the woods, I saw a blur of a figure right beside me staring at me from the tree line. I could swear that just as I made it out of the woods, it disappeared back into the tree line with a frown on its face. Except there was something wrong with the face. It was upside down. It happened fast and without warning, and his disappearance never made national news. It tried. A few hopeful publications, mostly local, blew it over their front page spreads in hopes that it might gain feet. But it never caught fire. It simply fizzled out, withered, died. Which might have been a tragedy had the 6-year-old boy not been found, or rather returned. He wandered out of the wood nearly 2 months after vanishing from thin air. His clothes torn, his hair scraggy, his ribs distending through his pale belly. But he was alive, and by all accounts his story ends there. It doesn't. And if you're familiar with the disappearance of Jeremy Kent, I suggest you stop reading now. Take the wholesale happy ending and covet it. Hold it dear. Protect it like a flame on the brink. Happy endings are rare enough, and if you continue reading, I can't promise you won't lose hope altogether. But the truth is rarely a warm pat on the back. The truth oftentimes rips apart the soft, safe notion that the world is a decent place, shreds it to ribbons, which I fear is the case with this story. Then again, what the hell do I know? I guess nothing more than the story as it was told to me. September 29th, 1989. You've never seen anything like Yellowstone in autumn. A world captured in amber, a vast theater alive with the changing of seasons. The trees, burnt orange, released their leaves in great trickles that blanketed the ground, crunching underfoot like the spines of dead insects. Halloween was just around the corner, and you could taste it on the wind. It rode the air like birdsong, sweet but imperceptibly ripe, like a candy apple gone to corruption. It was a good taste, though, even if an undercurrent of rot hid beneath the first sweet bite. Jeremy was sure of that. It was a good taste. It meant everything was going to be all right. Nothing could be perfect all the time, and he was proud he knew that. It was a very mature notion for a 7-year-old, according to Ms. Calhoun, who, despite his very mature notions, still gave him a C+ on that pop quiz last year. He sighed and his eyes roved, capturing the environment, peering into the shadows, the tangles of undergrowth that lined both sides of the trail. It was thin and winding, slicing around bends where the trees had been felled by the first men. To his left a stream burbled, cutting over rocks as pink streaks of salmon fought the current. Wildlife shot through the brush, always just out of view. He tried to see a bird, or a deer, or a Sasquatch. All he saw was big fat nothing. He could hear the birds protesting silence with their sharp cries in the trees, no doubt in the air. And Jeremy wondered what they had to worry about. Couldn't they just fly away? He trudged along behind Mom and Dad, plunging his hiking stick, which was really just a branch he had collected up along the way, into the hard earth, driving himself forward, step, 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 step. He slashed at the air. He was night. It was lovely, he thought. He wanted to say it aloud. He liked that word. Lovely. He'd heard Cagney say it once on an old gangster film, and it had stuck to his brain like nice words did. Lovely, he said, voice hoarse with the cold. Was that? That was Dad, glancing back. Nothing, Jeremy said, suddenly embarrassed. He looked up at the sky, gunmetal gray, choked with clouds, pregnant with snow. Just ahead, a great mountain rose above the canopy, its high peak snow-capped, like the horn of some primitive creature that had fallen with the dinosaurs. Or could it be from before? Jeremy's mind raced with the archaeological implications of his discovery. He imagined a time, long ago, a time of knights and kings and queens and princesses, and the epic clash of steel on steel, the ogres beneath bridges and dragons belching flame, the great plated creature that now loomed before him, a rhinoceros of sorts, a Jeremy Oceros. He smiled. That sounded very good. A creature named after him. Imagine that. Kyle would shit bricks when he saw Jeremy on the 6 o'clock, and it was with this thought, a smile tugging at his lips, that the world stopped. It seemed to flicker, jarring off its axis for a hair of a second. 1,000 miles away, a woman in a supermarket forgot what she was looking for on aisle 9. 50 miles away, a baby who had been wailing non-stop all morning fell quiet. And 5 feet away, Mr. Kent realized his watch had stopped. He smacked it, and the world was returned. The birdsong came, louder than before. The rustling of wildlife disturbed the brush, and Mr. Kent, seeing that his watch had frozen at 3:13 precisely, turned back to ask his son if he wanted to wind it. It had always been their thing. Jeremy enjoyed the responsibility of controlling his father's time, and Mr. Kent was more than happy to oblige him. Truth was, winding his watch was a pain in the keister. The crown stuck, and you really had to. That was when the world stopped a second time. But just for him. The trail behind him and his wife was totally empty. Jeremy had vanished. No one saw the man in the suit, and if they had, they wouldn't have considered it strange. A man in a suit standing in the woods, that was a strange thing. But when you saw him, and he saw you, your eyes had a way of skipping over him, assimilating him to the environment, the trick of the eyes, of light and shadow. He was watching Jeremy. He was listening to him. He saw it all unfold. He heard the father's cry. His parents spent the next hour screaming his name, and the next date after that with a search party, combing the tree line in a grid, a helicopter chopping overhead as a spotlight blasted through the darkness of night. A dragnet fell and came up empty, again and again, day after day, week after week, as the birds flew north and the deer charted a path toward the mountain, and all the while his parents lost hope, trying to hold on, unable. The weather had turned. The nights were harsh, the land raw, the animals hungry, for winter was nearly here. It was November 14th, 1989, when Jeremy Kent trudged out of the woods, eyes glazed, skin pale, his walking stick leading the way as he marched onward into the campsite like a little toy soldier. A camper screamed when she saw him, trucking along with nowhere to go. The scream snapped him out of it. He froze like a deer in headlights and looked wildly around. Then his eyes swam, his legs wavered, and he collapsed, folded like an old pair of pants with no one inside. Poof, over and out. He was airlifted to a hospital, severely dehydrated, malnourished, on the brink of death. When he awoke, they asked him what happened, asked him again and again, and I told them, I tried to tell them. But they didn't believe me. I didn't remember. It was all empty, a void, and they thought I was lying, because how was such a thing possible? And Mom and Dad tried to coax it out of me, asking if I'd been abused, and I didn't know what that meant, and I just couldn't remember. That much was true. I didn't remember. But I lied about one part because there was something I did remember, and I've carried it with me since the day I returned. The hypnotist was staring at me. She was lovely. Maybe 30 with a good firm face and eyes that could cut. Twin blues staring out from beneath a tumble of auburn curls. I didn't blame her. It was a crazy thing, all of it. Not that she seemed to be judging. She was considering, chewing through it in her head. The silence was making my teeth scream. Can I smoke? Before she could object, I lit one. My eyes stopped tingling. My legs settled. She slid a bowl across the coffee table for my ash. It an antique thing that had no right being soiled by cigarettes, but what the hell? She knew I needed it. So, she began, then stopped, shook her head, and sat back to further ruminate on my request. Claire Hoskins didn't dress like a hypnotist, more like a lawyer who kills your wallet. A velvet switchblade, a boardroom shogunate, suit skirt, serious expression resting on her face. She was the best, and her by-the-hour rate reflected that, as did her office, tall, well-lit, done up in inoffensive creams and soft lived-in furniture. The bookshelves betrayed her. Instead of leather-bound tomes on the virtues of psychotherapy, her shelves were crowded by a vast collection on the unorthodox. Astrology, horology, again with the time, and the only sign that she had fancy ideas about the world was the crystal ball on her desk. "So you want to forget," she said finally. "You think I can hypnotize and make you forget?" I drew blue smoke, hashed. "You can make people quit drinking, quit these." Drew blue smoke, hashed. "Right," she said. "But habituation is different. I can take away the desire, but not the urge." "That's a paradox," a trace of a smile. "The human mind is a paradox. It's a puzzle without answer. You think I'm crazy?" She blinked. "No, Jeremy. James. No, James, I don't think you're crazy. I looked you up. After I got your email, I knew she would. I rolled my shoulders. And you went through a terrible thing." "How do you know? For that matter, how do I know?" "I can't remember. Did you miss that part? The part where it's a great big freaking pit of static? All of it. Poof, here's me. I pull a vanishing act and come back 2 months later with shit all for brains. How does that happen? Abracadabra?" It tumbled out of me. I shut my mouth, corking it off. But I saw it was too late. I was losing her. She thought I was a nut. A hypnotist thinking I was a nut. The hell is that? Okay, look, I'm sorry. Claire, listen to me. Can I call you Claire? What do you call a hypnotist? Claire's fine. But she was eager to get me out of her office. A beat. I lied, okay? That's why I came here. Not because I lied, but because what I lied about. She looked at me, her eyes reading mine. "I have trouble sleeping. That's why Look, I've tried it all. Pills, weed, booze, white noise. But it's all the same. It's the same thing every night. And I swear to God, if I don't get fixed, I'm going to blow up. I swear I'm going to pop like a goddamn zit. Probably on the underside of some bridge. But I've tried. I've freaking tried." And I took a trembling breath. My lungs were getting tight. The crisp tick of a grandfather clock cut the silence. Pain hit my eyes. A face in the darkness, smooth, smiling, hair drawn back in a black streak. The man in the suit. I lied. To all of them, because there was one thing I did remember. This was hard. I hesitated, looking at the curling stem of ash, hesitation gluing my tongue to the roof of my mouth. I swallowed. "I remember dying out there, and I want you to help me forget it." I almost wish I'd stopped there, given up on the whole operation and just bottled the dreams, maybe sent for a prescription, whatever. Drowned myself in whoever, any freaking thing, but what came next. But I didn't leave. I sat there as she processed what she'd been told. I listened as she explained the only way it might work. And I bought it all. Yes, please, medium. Well, no, I don't need that with salt. There was still time to get out, but I didn't, because I needed it to work. More than anything ever. She was going to hypnotize me. She was going to make me remember so that I could forget.